The winter of 1884 had clamped its jaws around Arthur Prescott's isolated Montana ranch and refused to let go. Snow lay in deep, sculpted drifts against the north walls of the cabin and barn, the wind a constant, mournful voice that seemed to echo the hollowness within him. Arthur, a man carved from the same unforgiving landscape, moved through his days with a grim, practiced efficiency. His heart, he often thought, was a frozen stone in his chest, buried deeper than any winter frost. It had been 5 years since Martha and their little boy, Tom, had been taken by the fever, 5 years since laughter had last echoed in the small cabin, 5 years since love had felt like anything more than a cruel, remembered ache. He'd come to this valley seeking solace in solitude, a place where the vastness of the land might absorb the enormity of his grief. Instead, the silence had only amplified it. The ranch was functional, his cattle mostly well tended despite the brutal weather, his chores performed with a mechanical precision that kept his mind from straying too often into the shadowed corners of memory. But it was a life of stasis, a long, slow waiting for an end he neither hastened nor feared. His face, weathered by sun and wind, rarely softened from a stern, guarded expression. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, held a permanent chill. He spoke little, even to his horse, and the few trips he made to the distant settlement of Redemption for supplies were purely transactional. His interactions with others kept to a curt minimum. He had given up on connection, on warmth, on the very notion of a thaw within himself. The land was his only companion, and it was a harsh, demanding one. The blizzard arrived not with subtlety, but as a roaring white demon, blotting out the world beyond his cabin windows for 3 solid days. Arthur hunkered down, rationing his firewood, tending the small herd he'd managed to shelter in the lean-to beside the barn. The wind shrieked like a banshee, piling snow into monstrous, shifting sculptures. On the 4th morning, the wind dropped to a malevolent whisper, the snow still falling but with less fury. He knew he had to check his fences, what was left of them, and see to any stray cattle that might have survived the onslaught. Bundled in layers of wool and hide, he ventured out into a world transformed, a landscape of blinding white under a bruised, leaden sky. It was near the creek line where the skeletal arms of cottonwoods clawed at the oppressive clouds that he found her. At first, he thought it was a drift-covered log or a fallen animal. Then he saw the edge of a beaded moccasin, a dark sweep of hair against the snow, the faintest rise and fall of a deerskin-clad shoulder. Caution warred with a deeply buried instinct he'd thought long dead. He approached slowly, his rifle held ready, though the figure was clearly incapacitated. She was native. That much was evident from her attire and features, even partially obscured by snow. He knelt, brushing the snow from her face. It was young, gaunt, and etched with hardship, but possessed a quiet dignity even in unconsciousness. Her skin was like ice. He felt for a pulse at her neck, thready, dangerously slow, but there. For a long moment, Arthur stared at her, the wind whipping his hair around his face. Every instinct for self-preservation, for maintaining the frozen solitude of his existence, screamed at him to leave her, to let the wilderness claim its own. It was not his concern. He had enough burdens. But then an image of Martha, her face pale with fever, flickered in his mind. He gritted his teeth, a muscle working in his jaw. He just couldn't. With a grunt of effort that was as much mental as physical, he carefully lifted the woman. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile weight in his arms. He turned back towards the cabin, his boots sinking deep with each step, the wind trying to tear her from his grasp. The journey was arduous, each footfall a battle against the clinging snow and his own profound reluctance. This, he knew, was a disruption, a crack in the icy armor he had so carefully constructed around himself. Inside the cabin, the warmth of the stove was a welcome shock after the biting cold. He laid her gently on the rough-hewn floor near the hearth, not on his own narrow cot, an unconscious boundary already drawn. For a moment, he just stood there, looking down at her, a stranger who had literally fallen into his life, threatening the bitter peace he had cultivated. Her breathing was shallow, a faint rasp in the otherwise silent room. He worked with a detached efficiency, stripping away her snow-caked, frozen outer garments. Her deerskin dress was worn, her moccasins thin. Beneath them, her limbs were like marble, cold and unyielding. He chafed her hands and feet, trying to restore circulation, his touch impersonal, almost clinical. He wrapped her in one of his thickest wool blankets, tucking it tightly around her, then propped her head on a spare saddle blanket. He brewed coffee, strong and black, and when it was ready, he carefully lifted her head, trying to get a few sips of the hot liquid between her lips. Most of it dribbled out. Hours passed. He kept the stove stoked, the cabin uncomfortably warm for his own liking. He checked on her periodically, his expression unreadable. He saw the fine, high cheekbones, the smooth brow, the way her dark lashes lay against her skin. There were old scars on her arms, faint white lines that spoke of a life that had known its share of pain long before she'd collapsed in his snowbound valley. He found himself wondering, against his will, who she was, where she had come from, what desperate circumstances had driven her out into such a deadly storm. Late in the afternoon she stirred, her eyelids fluttered, then opened. Dark, disoriented eyes stared up at him, widening slightly with fear as they focused on his unfamiliar bearded face and the strange surroundings of the cabin. She tried to sit up, a small, choked sound escaping her lips. "Easy now," Arthur said, his voice rough from disuse. "You were near frozen, found you in the snow." She said nothing, merely watched him, her gaze intense and searching, like a cornered animal. He could see the struggle for comprehension in her eyes, the dawning awareness of her vulnerability. He offered her water in a tin cup, and this time she managed to sip some, her hand trembling as she weakly tried to hold the cup herself. He helped her, his large, calloused hand steadying hers. The contact was brief, functional, yet it felt strangely significant in the charged silence of the room. "What is your name?" he asked, more to break the oppressive quiet than from any real expectation of an answer. She looked at him, her lips parting slightly, then closing again. After a moment, her voice, soft and raspy, filled the small space. "Winona." "Arthur Prescott," he replied, a simple statement of fact. He saw no reason to offer more. The days that followed were filled with a tense, unspoken negotiation of space and presence. Winona recovered slowly. She remained wary, her movements quiet and economical, her eyes missing nothing. She spoke little, and only when directly addressed, her English hesitant but understandable. Arthur, for his part, maintained his gruff, distant demeanor, though he ensured she had food, broth, then stew, and kept the fire burning brightly. He slept on the floor by the door, his rifle beside him, a position that spoke of both protection and mistrust. He learned, in fragmented sentences, that she was Lakota, that her people had been scattered, that she had been traveling for many weeks, seeking a distant, rumored band of relatives. She did not elaborate on the hardships she must have faced, but her haunted eyes and the thinness of her frame told their own story. Arthur listened without comment, offering no judgment, no pity, merely the stoic acceptance of a man who understood that life was often a litany of sorrows. He found himself watching her sometimes, when she thought he wasn't looking. The way her slender fingers mended a tear in her deerskin dress with a bone needle and sinew she produced from a small pouch he'd recovered with her. The quiet grace in her movements, even when constrained by weakness. There was a resilience about her, an unyielding core of strength that he, a man who prided himself on his own fortitude, found himself grudgingly respecting. One evening, as he was cleaning his rifle by the firelight, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "You are a sad man." Arthur's hands stilled. He didn't look at her. "Many people are sad." "Your sadness is a heavy blanket," she said, searching for the words, "like the storm." He made no reply, resuming his task with deliberate movements, but her words lingered, unsettling him. He had thought his grief was a private thing, locked away. That she could see it, name it, felt like an intrusion, yet also, strangely, a form of recognition. As Winona regained her strength, a quiet rhythm established itself in the cabin. She began to help with small chores, sweeping the rough-planked floor with a makeshift broom, tending the fire, her presence gradually becoming less of an imposition and more a silent companionship. She had a knowledge of the land that surprised him. She pointed out edible roots he'd overlooked, showed him how to make a soothing tea from willow bark for the ache in his shoulder. These small offerings were made without expectation, simple acts of shared existence. The harshness of the winter began to recede. The sun climbed higher, its warmth tangible. The snowdrifts slowly shrank, revealing the bruised and battered land beneath. Arthur knew that soon, Winona would be well enough to travel again. The thought brought a strange mixture of relief and an unidentifiable disquiet. He had grown accustomed to her quiet presence, to the subtle shift in the cabin's atmosphere from absolute solitude to a shared silence. One afternoon, he returned from checking his cattle to find her sitting by the creek, her dark hair unbound, washing it in the icy meltwater. The sun caught the blue-black sheen of it, and for a moment, Arthur simply stood and watched, a feeling akin to warmth, unfamiliar and unsettling, stirring in his chest. It was not desire, not in the way he had known it with Martha, but something softer, a recognition of beauty, of life persisting in the face of hardship. He turned away abruptly, angry at himself for the lapse, for the crack in his frozen resolve. The day came when the passes would likely be clear enough for travel. He had mended her worn moccasins, provided her with a small store of dried meat and a sturdy blanket. He expected her to announce her departure. Instead, she asked, "You go to the town, soon?" Arthur looked at her, surprised. "Need supplies. Why?" I have a few beads, small things. Maybe trade for cloth, needles?" Her gaze was direct, a hint of desperation in it. He considered it. Redemption was a rough town, intolerant of outsiders, especially natives. Taking her there would invite trouble, scrutiny. His first instinct was to refuse, to tell her it was too dangerous. But then he saw the quiet hope in her eyes, the dignity with which she made her request. And a stubborn, unfamiliar protectiveness rose in him. He had brought her this far. He could not abandon her to the uncertainties of the trail without at least this small measure of help. "We leave in the morning," he said, his voice gruffer than he intended. The journey to Redemption took the better part of a day. They rode in silence, Arthur on his sturdy gelding, Winona on the placid mare he usually used as a pack animal. He was acutely aware of the curious, often hostile glances they received from the few trappers and prospectors they passed on the trail. Winona sat straight and proud, her expression unreadable, but Arthur could feel the tension radiating from her. Redemption was a straggle of unpainted wooden buildings lining a muddy main street, its name a cruel irony for the hard-bitten souls who inhabited it. As they rode in, conversations died, heads turned. Arthur felt a familiar tightening in his gut, the old defensiveness rising. He ignored the stares, dismounting in front of Henderson's General Store, the largest and best-stocked establishment in town. "Stay close," he muttered to Winona, not looking at her but acutely aware of her presence beside him. Inside, the store was dim, smelling of dust, tobacco, and salted meat. Mr. Henderson, a portly man with small, avaricious eyes, looked up from his ledger. His gaze flickered from Arthur to Winona, lingering on her with an expression that made Arthur's hand clench. "Prescott," Henderson said, his tone cool. "Been a while. What can I do for you?" He deliberately ignored Winona. Arthur listed his needs: flour, salt, coffee, ammunition. As Henderson gathered the items, Arthur turned to Winona. "Show him what you have." Winona hesitantly produced a small, intricately beaded pouch. Henderson barely glanced at it. "Ain't got no use for Injun trinkets," he said dismissively. A slow anger began to burn in Arthur. "It's fine work. Take a proper look." Henderson sniffed, but perhaps sensing a shift in Arthur's tone, he picked up the pouch, turning it over in his pudgy fingers. "Might give you a bit of thread for it. Not much call for this sort of thing." Winona's face fell, but she said nothing. Arthur felt a surge of protectiveness that surprised him with its intensity. "She needs needles and cloth, good quality." Henderson raised an eyebrow. "Generous, Prescott. She, your new housekeeper?" The insinuation was clear, and it hung heavy in the air. Before Arthur could retort, the door creaked open and 3 men sauntered in. Arthur recognized them: Bart Logan and his 2 loutish companions, known for their drunkenness and casual cruelty. Logan's eyes, small and pig-like, fixed on Winona, a leering grin spreading across his unshaven face. Well, what have we here, Prescott?" Logan drawled, his voice thick with malice. "Didn't know you were partial to squaws." His companion snickered. Winona flinched as if struck, her dark eyes darting to Arthur, then to the floor. Arthur stepped slightly in front of her, his body tensing. "Mind your business, Logan." "Oh, I think it is my business," Logan said, taking a step closer. Don't like seeing our town dirtied by her kind." He spat a stream of tobacco juice dangerously close to Winona's feet. The air in the store crackled. Henderson looked nervous but said nothing, clearly unwilling to cross Logan. Arthur felt the cold rage he usually kept tightly leashed begin to slip. He thought of the years of solitude, the frozen grief, the careful emptiness he had cultivated. And then he thought of Winona's quiet strength, her resilience, the tentative trust she had begun to place in him. He thought of her gentle tending of his minor hurts, her voice soft as she spoke of the stars. "She's with me," Arthur said, his voice low and dangerous. "You have a problem with her, you have a problem with me." Logan laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Getting soft, Prescott, or just lonely?" He reached out, as if to grab Winona's arm. It happened fast. Arthur moved with a speed that belied his solid frame. His hand shot out, clamping around Logan's wrist like a vice. Logan yelped, his grin vanishing, replaced by surprise and pain. "I said," Arthur repeated, his voice like chipping ice, "leave her be." He tightened his grip, and Logan winced, trying to pull away. All right, Prescott, let go," Logan stammered, his bravado deflating. Arthur held him for another moment, his eyes boring into Logan's, then shoved him back. Logan stumbled into his companions, his face flushed with anger and humiliation. "This ain't over, Prescott," Logan snarled, but there was less conviction in his voice. He and his cronies backed towards the door, muttering threats. Arthur turned back to Henderson, who was now pale and flustered. "The cloth and needles, best you have, and I'll take that pouch back if you don't value it." His voice was calm, but with an underlying steel that Henderson clearly recognized. Silently, Henderson measured out a length of good wool cloth and produced a packet of needles. He accepted the coins Arthur laid on the counter without meeting his eyes. Arthur gathered his supplies and Winona's small pouch, then nodded curtly to her. "Let's go." They walked out into the watery sunlight, the eyes of redemption following them. Winona was silent, her head bowed. Arthur helped her mount the mare, then swung onto his own horse. They rode out of town the way they had come, leaving the whispers and hostile stares behind. The silence on the ride back to the ranch was different from the one on the way in. It was no longer fraught with unspoken anxieties, but filled with a new, fragile understanding. Arthur found himself replaying the scene in the store, the surge of protectiveness, the unexpected ease with which he had defended her. It was as if a dam had broken within him, a torrent of feeling he hadn't known he was still capable of. He glanced at Winona. She was looking at him, her dark eyes filled with an emotion he couldn't quite decipher. Gratitude, perhaps, but something more, something deeper. They reached the cabin as twilight was painting the sky in hues of violet and rose. The air was cool, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth, the promise of spring. Arthur unsaddled the horses, his movements methodical, his mind anything but. He was aware of Winona moving about inside the cabin, the soft sounds of her preparing a simple meal. When he entered, the fire was blazing cheerfully, and the aroma of stew filled the small space. She had laid out 2 tin plates, 2 cups. They ate in their accustomed silence, but it was a comfortable silence now, imbued with a shared experience. After they had finished, and the dishes were cleared, Arthur found himself restless. He stood by the small window, looking out at the darkening landscape. "Thank you," Winona said softly from behind him. For what you did, in the town." Arthur turned. She was standing near the hearth, the firelight catching the gentle curve of her cheek, the quiet dignity in her posture. "They had no right," he said, his voice still gruff, but lacking its usual edge. "Few believe that," she replied, a hint of old sorrow in her tone. She paused, then added, "You were, like the bear, protecting its own." A faint smile touched Arthur's lips, a rare occurrence that softened the harsh lines of his face. "Maybe." He hesitated, then found himself speaking the words that had been locked inside him for so long. "My wife, Martha, and my son, Tom, they died 5 years ago." The admission hung in the air, raw and painful, yet also, somehow, a relief. Winona's expression softened with a profound, unspoken empathy. She didn't offer empty platitudes or condolences. She simply nodded, her eyes holding his, acknowledging his pain. "Grief is a long shadow," she said quietly. "It walks with you." He looked at her, truly looked at her, not as an imposition, not as a responsibility, but as a woman, a fellow traveler in a world that was often cruel and unforgiving. He saw the strength that had carried her through unimaginable hardships, the quiet wisdom in her eyes, the gentle spirit that had not been extinguished by loss or fear. And in that moment, the ice around Arthur Prescott's heart, an edifice 5 years in the making, began to truly melt. "I thought," he began, his voice raspy with emotion, "I thought I'd never feel anything again, except the cold." Winona took a step towards him, then another, until she stood before him. She reached out a hesitant hand, laying it gently on his arm. Her touch was light, yet it seemed to send a current of warmth through him, chasing away the chill that had settled deep in his bones. "The cold passes," she said softly. "Even the longest winter ends, spring comes." He looked down at her hand on his arm, then into her eyes. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Arthur Prescott didn't feel quite so alone. The cabin, once a monument to his grief, felt different now. It felt full. Hope, a fragile, tender shoot, began to unfurl within him. The days that followed took on a new color. The routine of the ranch continued, but it was no longer a solitary endeavor. They worked together, a quiet understanding growing between them. Winona's knowledge of plants and healing proved invaluable, and her presence brought a subtle life to the stark cabin. She fashioned small, beautiful things from scraps of leather and stone, her hands always busy. She taught him the Lakota names for the stars that blazed in the clear night sky, and he, in turn, shared stories of his boyhood in the East, memories he thought he had forgotten. There were no grand declarations, no sudden passionate avowals. Theirs was a love born of shared hardship, of mutual respect, of the slow, steady healing of two wounded souls. It was in the comfortable silences, the shared smiles over a hot meal, the way his hand would instinctively find hers as they walked by the creek in the evenings. One evening, as the first wildflowers of spring were beginning to dot the valley floor with color, Arthur found Winona sitting on the porch step, looking out at the mountains, now softened by the haze of new growth. He sat beside her, their shoulders brushing. "The land is changing," she said, her voice thoughtful. "It feels kinder." Arthur looked out at the familiar vista. It was the same land, the same mountains, the same sky. But she was right. It did feel different, less harsh, less empty. It felt like home, in a way it hadn't since Martha and Tom. He realized it wasn't the land that had changed, but him. Winona had walked into his life, a stranger lost in a storm, and in saving her, she had, in turn, saved him from the frozen wilderness of his own heart. He reached for her hand, his calloused fingers interlacing with hers. She turned to him, her dark eyes luminous in the fading light. A question lay within them, and an answer. "Stay, Winona," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Stay here, with me." A slow smile spread across her face, radiant as the rising sun. "I am home, Arthur," she replied softly. And as the stars began to prick the darkening sky, Arthur Prescott, the cowboy who had once believed his heart to be irrevocably cold, knew that love, in its most unexpected and resilient form, had found him again. The cabin behind them, once a sanctuary of sorrow, now held the promise of a shared future, a testament to the enduring power of connection and the quiet courage it took to let oneself heal, to let oneself love. Even after the harshest of winters, the land, once a reflection of his isolation, now seemed to embrace them, a silent, watchful guardian of the new life they would build together. A life where unexpected kindness had blossomed into a love as vast and enduring as the Montana sky itself. The wind was a blade, honed on endless plains of ice and snow. It screamed around the broken cabin, a sound that was both a lament and a threat. Inside, Hannah huddled deeper into the thin, threadbare blanket, the sound of the wind, a constant reminder of the world outside and the world that was gone. Her family was a phantom limb, an ache that was dull one moment, sharp and unbearable the next. Her husband, Thomas, strong and hopeful, had believed they could make a life here, carving a place from the unforgiving land. Her daughter, Sarah, all bright eyes and quick laughter, had loved the way the snow sparkled like captured stars. Now, only the sparkle was left, cold and distant, outside the cracked window pane. Grief sat with her, heavy and silent, a second body in the small, freezing space. It had arrived the day the sickness took first. Thomas, then Sarah, swift and brutal as a wolf pack on a lone deer. Hannah had buried them herself, the ground a frozen, unyielding enemy. The effort had stolen the last of her strength, leaving her weak and shivering, the meager fire in the hearth long dead. Food was gone. Hope was a distant, forgotten son. She was simply waiting now, waiting for the cold or the hunger or the sheer, overwhelming sorrow to finish what the sickness had started. The cabin, their dream, was a tomb of splintered wood and frozen memories. Days bled into one another, marked only by the slow descent into deeper cold and a more profound emptiness. Her body was a shell, mind adrift in a haze of fever and memory. She saw Thomas's smile, heard Sarah's giggle, felt the phantom warmth of their hands. These visions were sustenance and torture, a cruel reminder of what the icy wasteland had stolen. The prejudice they had faced when they arrived, the suspicion from the nearest small settlement towards outsiders, seemed trivial now, a forgotten sting compared to the gaping wound of loss. She was an outsider everywhere, now, even in her own skin. She did not know how long she had been alone. Time had lost its meaning, dissolving into a single, protracted moment of suffering. The storm had buried the cabin even deeper, drifts piling against the walls, sealing her in. It felt final, like the earth pulling a shroud over her small, insignificant life. She closed her eyes, the image of Sarah's face shimmering behind her eyelids. She wanted to follow. Then, a sound, not the wind, a crunch, muffled but distinct from outside. Hannah's eyes fluttered open. It must be the wind, she thought, playing tricks. The snow was too deep, the cold too absolute for anyone to be out there. Especially not anyone who would care to find her. She was forgotten, a ghost in the making. The sound came again, closer this time. A rhythmic thud, like something heavy striking packed snow, then wood. Her heart, sluggish and weak, gave a tiny, startled lurch. Fear, a forgotten sensation, pricked at her. Was it an animal? A bear, woken early? Or worse, men from the settlement, come to claim the cabin, or simply to ensure the troublesome outsiders were truly gone. They hadn't been welcoming, their faces hard and unwelcoming, their words few and sharp. The thudding continued, insistent, closer to the door. Then a voice, deep, resonant, speaking words she did not understand, but the tone was not hostile. It was cautious, perhaps curious. It was followed by the sound of snow being shoveled or pushed away from the door. Her breath hitched. Someone was out there. The door groaned, straining against the snow piled high. Light, weak and diffused by the white landscape, filtered into the gloom. A figure stood silhouetted against the brightness, large and broad-shouldered. He stepped inside, bringing with him the sharp bite of the outside air, but also, surprisingly, a faint smell of wood smoke and something wild and clean. He was a native man, dressed in furs and hides that seemed to belong to the land itself. His face, framed by dark hair and weathered by the elements, was unreadable. His eyes, dark and intelligent, swept across the cabin, resting on her huddled form. Hannah could only stare, too weak to move, too bewildered to speak. This was not someone from the settlement. They had made it clear they wanted nothing to do with the local tribes, their fear and suspicion a palpable thing. Yet, here one stood, in the wreckage of her life. The man said something in his language, his voice low and steady. Hannah shook her head slightly. I don't understand, she whispered, her voice raspy and unused. He paused, his gaze sharp, assessing her clearly fragile state. He looked around the cabin again, seeing the empty hearth, the barren shelves, the single, still form beneath the blanket. Understanding seemed to dawn in his eyes, not sudden, but slow and heavy, like the melting of a deep snowdrift. He knelt, slowly, carefully, a large man moving with unexpected grace. He reached out a hand, not to touch her, but towards the cold hearth. He gestured to the empty space, then made a motion of striking flint. "Fire," Hannah croaked, the word a question and a desperate plea. He nodded, a single, firm dip of his head. He stood again and moved with quiet efficiency. He went back outside briefly, returning with an armful of dry kindling and larger logs. He worked quickly, kneeling by the hearth, his movements practiced and sure. Soon, a small flame licked at the kindling, hesitant at first, then growing bolder, chasing the shadows from the corner of the room. The warmth, though slight, felt like a miracle. He did not speak again for a long time, focusing on building the fire, ensuring it caught properly. Hannah watched him, wary but mesmerized. His presence filled the small space, not with aggression, but with a quiet strength that was both intimidating and strangely comforting. He was entirely unlike the men she had known, or the ones from the settlement with their nervous energy and quick judgments. This man was grounded, solid as the ancient mountains she could sometimes see in the distance. When the fire was burning steadily, casting dancing light on the walls, he turned back to her. He had something in his hand, a small pouch. He opened it, revealing dried meat and what looked like berries. He knelt again, holding a piece of the meat out to her. "Eat," he said, the word clear and simple, his voice still low. It was the first English word he had spoken. Hannah hesitated. Every instinct screamed caution. He was a stranger, from a people she had been told to fear. But the smell of the food was overpowering, a siren song to her starved body. And his eyes, though serious, held no malice, only a quiet, watchful patience. She reached out a trembling hand and took the meat. It was tough but flavorful, and she chewed it slowly, tears pricking her eyes at the sheer unexpected goodness of it. It had been so long. He gave her a little water from a skin he carried, holding it for her as she drank. He watched her with that same steady, unreadable gaze. She felt a deep flush of shame at her weakness, her disheveled state, but he gave no sign of judgment. He simply observed. He stayed through the night, sitting by the fire, a silent, watchful guardian. Hannah drifted in and out of sleep, the unfamiliar warmth and the presence of another human being, even this quiet stranger, a strange balm to her ravaged soul. The wind still howled, but it felt less menacing now, held at bay by the man and the fire. In the morning, he was still there. The fire had been replenished. He rose as she stirred, moving towards the door. He paused, looking back at her. "I am Dakota," he said, his voice calm. He gestured outside. "Snow deep, stay." Hannah managed a weak nod. "Hannah," she replied. "Thank you." He nodded once more and went outside. She heard him working again, clearing more snow. He returned later with more wood and, to her astonishment, a freshly killed rabbit. He cleaned it expertly outside and brought it in, preparing to cook it over the fire. The smell of the cooking meat filled the cabin, a promise of life returning. Over the next few days, Dakota became a silent, steady presence. He did not speak much, but his actions were clear. He brought food, rabbit, ptarmigan, roots he dug from beneath the snow. He kept the fire burning. He repaired the broken window pane with a piece of hide, stopping the worst of the drafts. He moved around the small cabin with quiet respect for her space, never intrusive, simply present. Hannah began to recover, slowly. The food gave her strength. The warmth chased away the deep chill in her bones. As her body healed, her mind began to clear, but the grief remained, a constant, dull ache beneath the surface. Sometimes she would weep silently, the tears freezing on her cheeks before she could wipe them away. Dakota would not comment, would not offer platitudes. He would simply ensure the fire was warm, or quietly place a mug of hot water near her. His silence was not indifference, it was a deep, respectful understanding of pain that could not be spoken away. She learned to read his quiet cues. A slight shift in his posture meant he was about to go outside. A particular look at the fire indicated he needed more wood. They communicated mostly through gestures, simple words, and shared tasks. She helped him skin the rabbit, her hands clumsy at first, then gaining back some of their old familiarity with work. They cleared snow together, him taking the heavy shovel work, her sweeping near the door. One evening, as the fire crackled, Hannah found her voice. "My husband, my daughter." She began, the words catching in her throat. "The sickness, it took them, they're buried, just outside." She gestured vaguely towards the snow-covered ground. Dakota looked at her, his dark eyes fathomless. He did not say he was sorry, he did not offer empty condolences. Instead, he looked towards the door, then back at her. "They walk with the ancestors," he said simply, his voice gentle. "Their spirits are free of the cold." His words were not what she expected, but they resonated deeper than any conventional sympathy could have. He spoke of spirits, of ancestors, of a world beyond the physical. It was a perspective steeped in the land, in something ancient and enduring. It acknowledged her loss without diminishing it, placing it within a larger, more natural order. Tears spilled down her face, but they were not entirely tears of sorrow this time. They were also tears of release, of being seen and understood in a way she hadn't been, not truly, since her family was gone. As the weeks passed, the snow began its slow, reluctant retreat. Patches of brown earth appeared, muddy and clinging. The sun, higher in the sky now, offered real warmth. Hannah grew stronger, able to move around the cabin easily, to manage the fire herself, to walk outside without collapsing. Dakota still came, less frequently now, bringing fresh game or checking on her wood supply. He was teaching her, without explicit lessons, how to see the land differently, how to find what it offered, even in its harshness. He showed her tracks in the mud, pointed out edible plants beginning to sprout, taught her how to set snares. Their silence became comfortable, companionable. She learned he lived some distance away, deeper in the wilderness, part of a band that moved with the seasons. He did not speak of his own life in detail, but she gleaned fragments, a deep respect for the land, a quiet weariness with the encroaching world of the settlers, a fierce protectiveness of his people and their ways. She sensed he carried his own burdens, his own losses, buried deep beneath that stoic exterior. His eyes held a sadness that mirrored her own, a shared understanding of the price the world exacted. The prejudice of the settlement weighed on her mind. What would they think if they knew she had been living, even intermittently, with a native man? She had heard their talk, their fearful whispers, their dismissive labels. They saw the tribes as savage, as a threat, as less than human. It was a stark contrast to the quiet kindness and competence Dakota had shown her, a kindness that had literally saved her life. One afternoon, a group from the settlement arrived. They had waited until the snow had melted sufficiently to travel easily. They came ostensibly to check on her, but their real purpose was clear in their prying eyes and the way they glanced around the small cabin. They were curious, suspicious, perhaps hoping to find reason to dislike her more, or to claim the land Thomas had cleared. There were 3 of them: Mr. Davies, the self-appointed leader of the small community, a man with a perpetually pinched expression; Mr. Gable, younger, shifty-eyed, and a woman, Martha, whose mouth was set in a thin, disapproving line. "Hannah," Davies called out, his voice booming, trying to sound concerned. He stepped into the cabin, Gable and Martha hovering behind him. "Heard the sickness took your family, terribly sorry, just came to see you were all right." Hannah stood straighter, her hand going instinctively to her side, where she kept a small knife Dakota had sharpened for her. She was no longer the helpless woman shivering under a blanket. Her time in the cold, the quiet strength she had found, the connection she had formed, it had changed her. "I am fine, thank you, Mr. Davies," she said, her voice steady. Martha's eyes narrowed, taking in the tidier cabin, the remnants of a recent meal. "You seem recovered," she said, the word laced with suspicion, as if recovery itself were suspect. "The spring is coming," Hannah replied simply, "and I learned to make do." Gable's eyes darted around the room, lingering on the hide patching the window, the unfamiliar tools near the hearth. "Got help, did you?" he asked, his tone implying something unsavory. Hannah felt a surge of defiance. They expected her to be broken, desperate, maybe even dead. She was none of those things. "I had help," she said, meeting his gaze squarely. "Who?" Davies pressed, his voice hardening. "Nobody from the settlement came out this far. It ain't safe, not with. Well, not with them about." He gestured vaguely towards the wilderness. The implication hung heavy in the air. Them, the native people, their fear and prejudice were naked on their faces. Hannah felt a hot anger rise within her, burning away the last vestiges of her fear of their judgment. They offered no help when her family was dying, when she was starving and freezing. It was them, the people they demonized, who had shown her kindness, saved her life. "The wilderness provides, Mr. Davies," Hannah said, choosing her words carefully, giving nothing away, yet saying everything. "And sometimes unexpected kindness arrives when you need it most." Martha scoffed. "Kindness? Out here? From who?" "From someone who understands this land," Hannah said, her voice quiet but firm. She would not name Dakota, would not expose him to their narrow-minded cruelty. But she would not deny his help either. She would not let their prejudice taint the only good thing that had happened to her in months. Davies looked at her, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Frustration? Uncertainty? He couldn't force the information from her, and her quiet strength was clearly unsettling. "Well," he said, clearing his throat, "glad to see you're managing. We'll be heading back now. You let us know if you need anything." The offer felt hollow, a formality. "Thank you," Hannah said again, polite but distant. They left, their departure a relief. Hannah watched them go, their figures receding across the still muddy ground. She felt a new resolve solidify within her. She would not go back to the settlement. Their world was not hers, not anymore. Her world was here, in this rebuilt cabin, on this land that was slowly yielding to the spring sun, a world she shared, in a quiet, unspoken way, with the man who had saved her. Weeks turned into months. Spring bloomed, riotous and beautiful, a stark contrast to the brutal winter. Hannah learned to tend a small garden, using seeds Thomas had optimistically brought. She learned to fish in the nearby stream, Dakota showing her the best spots and teaching her how to make a simple weir. She became more self-sufficient, more attuned to the rhythms of the land. Dakota visited less frequently, but their connection deepened in his absence. She thought of him often, remembering his quiet strength, his steady gaze, the unexpected gentleness of his hands when he helped her. She realized she wasn't just grateful, she was beginning to feel something else, something warmer, more complicated. One day, he arrived not with game, but with a bundle wrapped in soft deerskin. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing a beautiful, hand-carved wooden bird. It was simple, elegant, its shape suggesting flight. He held it out to her. "For you," he said. His voice was soft, a rare sound. Hannah took it, her fingers tracing the smooth wood. It was a gift of immense value, given the scarcity of everything out here, given the time and skill it represented. More than that, it was a symbol, a tangible representation of his care, of the bond they had forged in the crucible of winter. "It's beautiful, Dakota," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." He did not smile, but his eyes softened around the edges. "Bird flies," he said, gesturing with his hand, a sweeping motion towards the sky. "Spirits fly, you are strong now, like the bird." It was the most he had ever said at once, the most overtly he had acknowledged her journey from near death to resilience. He saw her not just as the woman he had found, broken in the snow, but as someone who had found her strength again, someone who could fly. The summer was full of work and quiet growth. Hannah's garden thrived, her fishing skills improved. She saw Dakota more frequently now, sometimes staying for a few hours, sometimes sharing a meal she had cooked. They talked more, slowly, cautiously, sharing small pieces of their lives, their histories, their thoughts. He told her about the traditions of his people, the stories woven into the land, the deep connection they felt to the earth and sky. She told him about her life before, the small farm in Ohio, her dreams with Thomas, the crushing weight of their loss. They sat by the fire one evening, the stars a brilliant swath across the ink-black sky. The air was warm, fragrant with pine and earth. "My people, they do not trust," Dakota said, his gaze fixed on the flames. "They have seen what the settlers bring, sickness, broken promises, taking land." "I know," Hannah said softly. She had seen it too. The fear and greed in the settlement, the casual dismissal of anyone different. "You are different," he said, turning his head to look at her. You listen to the land. You are quiet, like the forest, strong, like the rock." Hannah's heart fluttered. His words were simple, but they held more weight than any elaborate praise. He saw her, not just a white woman, a settler, but Hannah, a person finding her way. "You saved my life, Dakota," she said, stating the simple truth that lay at the heart of their connection, when no one else would have. He looked away, back at the fire. "The spirits guided me," he murmured, almost to himself. "They did not want you to walk to the ancestors yet. Your path is here." His belief in the spiritual world was profound and unwavering. It was another difference between them, yet it didn't feel like a barrier. It felt like a different language, one she was slowly learning to understand, filled with respect for the unseen forces that shape the world. Their relationship remained unspoken, undefined by the labels her old world would have demanded. There was no courtship, no declarations. There was just shared silence, shared work, shared meals, a deep, growing respect, and an undeniable warmth that flowed between them, chasing away the lingering chill of loneliness. It was a bond forged in necessity and refined by mutual understanding, something quiet and strong, like the roots of an ancient tree. One late summer day, the quiet peace was shattered. Dust rose on the horizon, carried by the wind. Riders, many of them. They weren't from the settlement. These moved with a different kind of purpose, a more predatory air. Bandits, perhaps, or men looking for trouble. They were heading straight for Hannah's cabin. Dakota was there, helping her mend a section of fence. He saw them too, his body tensing, his eyes narrowing. "Trouble," he said, the single word sharp. Hannah felt a return of the old fear, the vulnerability that had consumed her after her family died. But it was different this time. It was not a helpless fear, it was a fear coupled with a fierce protectiveness for the small corner of the world she had built, and for the man standing beside her. "They will see you," Hannah said, a knot forming in her stomach. She knew the danger he was in, being seen here with a white woman, on land the settlers were claiming. "They will see us," Dakota corrected, his voice calm, resolute. He did not consider leaving her. The implication was clear, they faced this together. There was no time to run, they had to face it. Dakota moved quickly, efficiently. He instructed Hannah to get inside, to bar the door. He took up his bow, arrows nocked, his stance wide and steady. He was not just a man, he was a warrior, defending his ground. The riders arrived, pulling up their horses sharply before the cabin. There were 5 of them, rough-looking men, armed with rifles. Their leader, a burly man with a scarred face, grinned unpleasantly when he saw Dakota standing alone before the small cabin. "Well now," the leader sneered, his gaze flicking from Dakota to the cabin. "Look what we got here, a squaw man hidin' out with." "Well, looky there, a white woman." His grin widened, full of malice and cruel amusement. "Looks like you found yourself something cozy, redskin. But this ain't your land. This is our land now. And that woman, she belongs with her own kind." Prejudice and greed, side by side. Hannah's blood ran cold, but she stood firm behind the barred door, listening. They saw Dakota only through the lens of their hatred, reducing him to a label, ignoring the man, the helper, the protector he was. They saw her as property, something to be claimed or taken. Dakota said nothing, his face a mask of stone. He held his bow steady, an arrow aimed directly at the leader. His silence seemed to infuriate them. "Gonna be stupid, huh?" the scarred man taunted. "All right, boys, let's show him what happens when he thinks he can stand against us, and then we'll see about the woman." One of the riders dismounted, rifle raised. Dakota's arrow flew, impossibly fast. It struck the man in the shoulder with a sickening thud. He cried out, dropping his rifle. Chaos erupted. The remaining riders reacted, fanning out. Rifles barked. Dakota moved with astonishing speed and agility, a blur of motion. He was 1 man against 4, but he used the terrain, the cabin, the very air around them as his allies. Hannah, peering through a crack in the wall, watched in terrified awe. He was magnificent, dangerous, a force of nature himself. An arrow found its mark, another man falling from his horse. Dakota dodged rifle fire, the bullets splintering the wood of the cabin, whistling past his head. He was drawing them away from the door, away from her. His focus was absolute, his movements economical and deadly. He disappeared around the corner of the cabin, drawing the remaining riders after him. Hannah heard shouts, the thunder of hooves, more rifle shots. She gripped the knife, trembling, unsure what she could do. She was one woman, her strength still not what it had been. But she would not hide, not entirely. This was her home, her life. The man who had saved her life was out there fighting for them both. She heard a cry, sharp and pained. Her heart leaped into her throat. Dakota. Pushing aside her fear, Hannah unbarred the door and slipped out. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and dust. She crept around the side of the cabin, her eyes scanning the small clearing. 2 riders were down, their horses skittering nervously away. The scarred leader and 1 other man were still mounted, but their attention was focused on Dakota, who was partially concealed behind a large rock formation, his bow seemingly useless at this range. He had taken a hit. Blood bloomed darkly on his thigh, just above the knee. He was pressing a hand against it, his face tight with pain, but his eyes were still sharp, calculating. The two remaining men were trying to flush him out, circling warily. Seeing her emerge, the scarred man grinned again. Well, well, looky what came out to play. He started to turn his horse towards her. It was a diversion, unintended by her, but Dakota seized the moment. While their attention was split, he moved, drawing a knife, low and fast towards the remaining mounted man. Hannah knew she had to do something. She looked around frantically. There was a pile of dry branches Dakota had gathered for firewood, just a few feet away. An idea, reckless and desperate, flashed into her mind. She snatched up a smoldering log from the edge of the fight, where a stray shot had ignited some dry brush. She didn't hesitate. With a cry, she threw the burning log directly at the scarred leader's horse. The horse, startled by the sudden fire and Hannah's unexpected appearance, reared back with a shriek, throwing its rider. The scarred man hit the ground hard. It was enough. Dakota, despite his wound, was on the second man, his knife a blur. The fight was brutal, quick. The man fell. Dakota turned, favoring his injured leg, towards the scarred leader, who was scrambling to his feet, reaching for a fallen rifle. But Hannah was closer. Driven by a surge of adrenaline and a cold, hard fury, she ran towards the fallen man, the small knife in her hand. She wouldn't kill him, not like he would have killed Dakota, killed her, taken everything again, but she could stop him. She kicked the rifle away just as his fingers brushed against it. He snarled, turning his malice-filled eyes on her. "You stupid woman." Before he could do anything else, Dakota was there, a silent, imposing figure, despite his bleeding leg. He stood over the scarred man, his knife poised. The leader looked up at the impassive face, the dark eyes that promised swift, final justice. Fear, real fear, flashed in his eyes. "Get out," Dakota said, his voice low and dangerous, devoid of any hint of the gentleness Hannah had come to know. "Take your dead and gone." The scarred man scrambled backwards, away from the knife, away from the quiet intensity of the warrior. He glanced at his two fallen companions, then back at Dakota and the resolute woman standing beside him. He saw the look in their eyes, the unwavering resolve forged in hardship. He saw that they were willing to fight, not for greed, but for their lives, for their home, for each other. And he saw, perhaps, that he was beaten. He got unsteadily to his feet, clutching his arm where Hannah had kicked him. He cast one last hateful look at them, then turned and limped towards one of the remaining horses. He mounted awkwardly and rode away without a backward glance, leaving his dead behind. Silence descended, broken only by the nervous whinnying of the riderless horses and the distant cry of a hawk. The adrenaline drained away, leaving Hannah weak and shaking. She looked at Dakota, who was leaning heavily against the rock, pressing harder against his wound. "Dakota." She ran to him, kneeling by his side. The wound was deep, bleeding freely. "You're hurt." "It is nothing," he said, though his breath hitched slightly. "Nothing?" Hannah scoffed gently, her voice trembling. "You fought like the wind itself." She tore strips from her skirt, awkwardly trying to make a bandage. He watched her, his expression softening as she worked, her brow furrowed with concentration and concern. "You?" he said, his voice rougher now. "Through fire, like a spirit protector." Hannah gave a weak laugh, tears welling in her eyes. "I didn't think, I couldn't let them hurt you. Not after." She trailed off, the weight of everything they had been through together pressing in on her. He reached out a hand, hesitant, and gently touched her cheek. His thumb brushed away a tear. His eyes, usually so guarded, were open now, full of a warmth and depth that took her breath away. "We mend this," he said, looking down at his leg, then back at her. The "we" hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. It wasn't just his leg they would mend. It was their lives, together. They managed to get him back to the cabin. Hannah cleaned and bandaged the wound as best she could, using knowledge gleaned from years on the farm. He was stoic, only grunting slightly at the pain. Lying in her small bed, his large frame filling the space, he seemed vulnerable for the first time since she had met him. She sat by his side, tending the fire, watching him sleep fitfully. The crisis had passed, but it had changed things, clarified them. There was no going back to the quiet, undefined companionship. They had faced death together, fought for each other. The bond was no longer just about survival and gratitude, it was something deeper, something earned in the crucible of shared danger. He was slow to heal. The wound festered for a few days, Dakota growing feverish and weak. Hannah nursed him, applying poultices he instructed her to make from local plants, bathing his brow, coaxing him to drink. She slept little, her worry a constant companion. During those days and nights, the last walls between them crumbled. The man who had saved her life was now in her care, trusting her completely. The vulnerability was shared, creating an intimacy deeper than words. When the fever broke, and he began to recover, the cabin felt different. Quieter, yes, but also fuller. His presence was no longer that of a temporary visitor, but of someone who belonged. He watched her with a new openness in his eyes, a quiet affection that mirrored the feeling stirring in her own heart. One morning, sitting by the fire, the air cool but the sun promising warmth, he spoke. "My people, they will not understand," he said, his gaze steady. "They see only difference, as the men who came saw." Hannah nodded, understanding the difficult truth. His world, her world, they were colliding, and there were forces in both that would resist their connection. Prejudice was a stubborn vine, wrapping around hearts and minds. "And the people in the settlement," she replied, "they would not understand either. They fear what they don't know, and they hate what they fear." "Then," Dakota said, reaching out and taking her hand, his calloused fingers warm and strong around hers, "we make our own place, here, where the spirits guided me, where the bird flies." He wasn't asking for her hand in marriage in the way her old world defined it. He was offering a partnership, a shared future built on the foundation they had already laid: resilience, mutual respect, shared hardship, and the quiet, unexpected love that had blossomed in the icy wasteland. He was asking her to choose this life, with him, outside the boundaries of their old worlds, defiant of the judgments that would surely come. Hannah looked at his face, etched with the lines of a hard life, but softened now by hope and affection. She thought of the loneliness, the grief, the sheer despair that had almost claimed her. She thought of the quiet strength that had appeared at her door, the hand that had offered warmth and food and life. She thought of fighting side by side, of his belief in her strength, of the peace she felt in his silent company. This man, this quiet warrior from a different world, had not only saved her life, he had given her a reason to live again. He had shown her that kindness existed even in the harshest places, that connection could bloom in isolation, that resilience was not just about enduring, but about finding strength in vulnerability and shared purpose. He had helped her see beyond the grief, towards a future she hadn't dared to imagine. "Yes, Dakota," she said, her voice clear and firm. "Here, we make our place here." He did not smile, but the warmth in his eyes deepened, a silent promise. They sat together, hand in hand, watching the fire, the cabin silent around them. Outside, the spring wind whispered through the trees, no longer a blade, but a gentle sigh. The land, their witness, held its breath, ready to welcome them both home. Life was not easy. There were still challenges. The land demanded hard work, the isolation could be profound, and they knew the outside world, with its judgments and demands, was never truly far away. But they faced it together. Dakota taught her the ways of his people that resonated with her spirit, the respect for nature, the wisdom of the ancestors, the understanding of interconnectedness. Hannah shared the practical skills of farming and keeping a home, weaving their two worlds together into something new and strong. They built a life, piece by piece, season by season, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the unexpected places where love and belonging can be found. The cabin, once a tomb of loss, became a home, filled with the quiet rhythm of their shared existence, the warmth of their fire, and the deep, unspoken language of two souls who had found each other in the wilderness and chosen to build something beautiful from the ruins. They were two outsiders who had found a home in each other, defiant of the cold, the grief, and the prejudice of the world outside. Their story was quiet, private, etched into the very fabric of the land they called their own. It was a story of survival, yes, but more than that, it was a story of connection, of healing, and the enduring power of unexpected kindness in the face of overwhelming loss. It was a love story, written not in grand gestures or flowery words, but in shared silence, mutual respect, and the quiet strength of a hand held firmly in the face of the storm.